The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik was one of the most remarkable aircraft of World War II, a ground attack plane that became a legend on the Eastern Front and a nightmare for German forces. Produced in greater numbers than any other military aircraft in history, with over 36,000 built during the war, the Il-2 combined unprecedented armor protection with devastating firepower to create a weapon that could survive punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. The Germans came to fear and respect the Sturmovik, giving it the nickname Black Death and Concrete Bomber in recognition of its armored construction and deadly effectiveness. The aircraft played a crucial role in the Soviet Union's eventual victory over Nazi Germany, providing close air support to ground forces from the desperate defensive battles of 1941 through the final assault on Berlin in 1945. The Il-2's most distinctive feature was its revolutionary armored construction. Unlike other aircraft of the period, which added armor plates to protect critical areas, the Il-2 integrated armor directly into its structure. The front section of the fuselage, from the nose back to behind the cockpit, was constructed from armor steel plates ranging from 4 mm to 6 mm thick, with some areas featuring up to 12 mm of protection. This armored shell wasn't bolted onto a conventional airframe. It was the airframe, serving as the actual structure of the aircraft. The armor protected the engine, the radiators, the fuel tanks, and the pilot, forming what Soviet designers called an armored bathtub that enclosed all the vital components. This construction method was unprecedented in aviation. Most aircraft were built to be as light as possible, since every pound of weight reduced performance. Adding armor meant adding weight, which meant the aircraft would be slower, less maneuverable, and require more powerful engines. But Soviet designers, led by Sergei Ilyushin, made a calculated decision that survivability was more important than pure performance. Ground attack aircraft had to fly low and slow over enemy positions, making them vulnerable to ground fire from rifles, machine guns, and light anti-aircraft weapons. Conventional aircraft were extremely fragile when hit by ground fire. A single bullet in the wrong place could sever a control cable, puncture a fuel line, or wound the pilot, sending the aircraft crashing to the ground. The Il-2 was designed to absorb this punishment and keep flying. The armor worked spectacularly well. Il-2 pilots reported returning from missions with their aircraft riddled with bullet holes, sometimes hundreds of hits, yet with all critical systems still functioning. The 4 mm to 6 mm armor was proof against rifle-caliber bullets and machine gun fire from most angles. Even 20 mm cannon shells, the standard armament of German fighters, often failed to penetrate the armor when striking at oblique angles. There are documented cases of Il-2s returning to base with over 600 hits from small arms fire, and at least one case of an aircraft that reportedly survived more than 2,000 bullet strikes during its operational life, accumulating damage over multiple missions. This extraordinary durability had profound psychological effects on both sides. Soviet pilots gained confidence knowing their aircraft could survive hits that would doom other planes. They could press attacks closer to the target, delivering their weapons with greater accuracy, because they weren't as worried about being shot down by ground fire. German soldiers, conversely, experienced the frustration and fear of shooting at an aircraft, seeing their bullets strike home, yet watching the plane continue its attack run, apparently unaffected. The usual small arms and light anti-aircraft weapons that could threaten conventional aircraft seemed almost useless against the Sturmovik. The Il-2's armament made it devastatingly effective against ground targets. The standard configuration included two 23 mm cannon and two 7.62 mm machine guns in the wings, though later versions upgraded to more powerful 37 mm cannon. These weapons were specifically chosen for their effectiveness against armored vehicles, trucks, trains, and other ground targets. The 23 mm and 37 mm cannon could penetrate the thin top armor of German tanks and destroy lighter armored vehicles with ease. The aircraft could also carry up to 1330 pounds of bombs or other ordnance under the wings and fuselage. One of the Il-2's most feared weapons was the PTAB anti-tank bomblet. These small, shaped charged submunitions were carried in cassettes that would open in scats, that would open dats over a wide area. Each PTAB weighed only about 3 pounds, but its shaped charge could penetrate up to 70 mm of armor, enough to destroy any tank in existence if it struck the thin top armor. A single Il-2 could carry over 200 PTABs, and a formation of Sturmoviks could blanket an area with thousands of these deadly bomblets in seconds. German tank crews learned to fear attacks by Il-2s armed with PTABs, as there was little they could do to protect themselves. The bomblets would rain down from above, striking the vulnerable top surfaces of their tanks. Where armor was thinnest, the Il-2 also carried RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, unguided weapons that were inaccurate but psychologically devastating. The rockets made a distinctive screaming sound in flight, terrifying to troops on the ground. While rocket accuracy was poor, a salvo from multiple aircraft could saturate an area with explosive warheads, destroying vehicles, fortifications, and troop concentrations. The combination of cannon fire, bombs, and rockets made the Il-2 capable of attacking virtually any ground target. The Sturmovik's typical attack profile involved approaching the target at low altitude, often just a few hundred feet above the ground. The pilot would identify the target, usually an enemy column, defensive position, or concentration of vehicles, then begin a shallow dive to build up speed. As the aircraft approached, the pilot would open fire with cannon and machine guns, raking the target with armor-piercing and explosive shells. Simultaneously, the pilot would release bombs or rockets, then pull up and away from the target area. The entire attack run might last only seconds, but in that brief time an Il-2 could destroy multiple vehicles, kill dozens of soldiers, and create chaos and confusion among enemy forces. Flying the Il-2 required skill and courage. The aircraft was heavy and not particularly maneuverable due to its armor. Pilots had to fly low and slow during attack runs, making them vulnerable despite the armor protection. Early versions of the Il-2 were single-seat aircraft, leaving the pilot vulnerable to attacks from behind by German fighters. The loss rates were horrendous in the early years of the war. Il-2 units sometimes suffered 50% casualties in a single month. Stalin himself intervened, sending an angry telegram to aircraft factories demanding they produce two-seat versions with rear gunners to protect against fighter attacks. He wrote that the Red Army needed Il-2, like it needed air and bread, emphasizing the aircraft's critical importance. The addition of a rear gunner in later Il-2 versions improved survivability against fighter attacks, though the rear gunner's position was far less protected than the pilot's armored cockpit. Rear gunners suffered disproportionately high casualties, as they sat in an exposed position with minimal armor protection. The rear gun, typically a 12.7 mm heavy machine gun, gave the Il-2 some defensive capability against pursuing fighters. But German pilots learned to attack from below, or from angles where the rear gunner couldn't effectively return fire. German fighter pilots developed specific tactics for dealing with Sturmoviks. They learned that attacks from directly behind were dangerous due to the rear gunner, and often ineffective due to the armor protection. Instead, they would attack from below, where the Il-2 had less armor, or from the side, trying to hit the vulnerable wings and control surfaces. Some German pilots specialized in attacking Il-2s, learning exactly where to aim to have the best chance of bringing one down. Even so, destroying a Sturmovik required skill and often multiple passes, and there was always the risk that the Il-2's rear gunner would score a hit during one of these attacks. The psychological impact of the Il-2 on German ground forces cannot be overstated. Soldiers who experienced Sturmovik attacks described them as terrifying. The aircraft would appear suddenly at low altitude, the sound of their engines mixing with the scream of rockets and the crash of cannon fire. Within seconds, vehicles would be burning, men would be dead or wounded, and survivors would be diving for any available cover. The knowledge that small arms fire was largely ineffective against the aircraft added to the sense of helplessness. German troops could shoot back, and often did, but watching bullets spark off the armored fuselage without apparent effect was demoralizing. The Il-2 played crucial roles in virtually every major Soviet offensive from 1942 onwards. At Stalingrad, Sturmoviks attacked German supply columns and troop positions, contributing to the encirclement and eventual destruction of the German Sixth Army. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, Il-2s armed with PTAB anti-tank bomblets devastated German armored formations, destroying hundreds of tanks and helping blunt the German offensive. During Operation Bagration in 1944, which destroyed German Army Group Center, Sturmoviks provided constant close air support to advancing Soviet forces, attacking German strongpoints, destroying retreating columns, and preventing German forces from establishing defensive lines. The production numbers for the Il-2 reflect its importance to the Soviet war effort. At peak production, Soviet factories were building over 1,000 Il-2s per month. The aircraft was designed for mass production, with relatively simple construction methods that could be executed even by workers with limited training. This was crucial, as the Soviet Union had to evacuate much of its industrial base east of the Ural Mountains after the German invasion, setting up factories in new locations with new workers. The Il-2's design allowed these factories to produce aircraft in large numbers despite the difficult circumstances. The quality of production varied considerably, especially in the desperate early years, when factories were being hastily relocated and were operating under enormous pressure to meet quotas. Some aircraft left to factories with incomplete armor protection, inferior materials substituted for specified components, and inadequate quality control. Pilots sometimes complained about defects and problems with their aircraft. However, even imperfectly built Il-2s were formidable weapons, and as Soviet industry recovered and production methods improved, quality increased substantially. The Il-2's success influenced aircraft design well beyond World War II. The concept of heavily armored close air support aircraft proved its value on the Eastern Front, and post-war air forces studied the Sturmovik carefully when developing their own ground attack capabilities. The American A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed decades later for the same role of close air support and tank destruction, reflects many of the same design philosophies as the Il-2, including heavy armor protection around critical components and powerful cannon armament, optimized for destroying ground targets. Soviet pilots who flew the Il-2 had mixed feelings about their aircraft. They appreciated the armor protection and firepower, and they took pride in the damage they inflicted on enemy forces. But they also knew they were flying dangerous missions at low altitude, where they were vulnerable to all kinds of ground fire. The armor might protect against rifle bullets and machine gun fire, but heavier anti-aircraft weapons could still bring down a Sturmovik. German 37mm and 88mm anti-aircraft guns were deadly to Il-2, and later in the war, as German flak defenses improved, loss rates increased despite the armor protection. The tactical employment of Il-2s evolved throughout the war, as Soviet commanders learned how to use them most effectively. Early in the war, Sturmoviks were often sent on missions individually or in small groups, making them vulnerable to fighter attacks and reducing their effectiveness. By 1943, Soviet tactics had improved dramatically. Il-2s would attack in formations, sometimes dozens of aircraft at once, saturating target areas with firepower. Fighter escorts protected the Sturmoviks from German interceptors. Coordination with ground forces improved, with forward air controllers directing aircraft to the most important targets. Timing attacks to support ground offensives became standard practice, with waves of Sturmoviks hitting German positions just before Soviet tank and infantry assaults. The maintenance requirements for the Il-2 were substantial. The aircraft operated from primitive forward airfields, often nothing more than cleared fields with minimal facilities. Maintenance crews worked in difficult conditions, often under enemy fire, to keep the aircraft flying. The armor that protected the Il-2 in combat also made repairs more difficult, as damaged armor plates had to be cut away and replaced, a time-consuming process. Engines required frequent maintenance due to the stress of low-altitude operations and combat damage. Despite these challenges, Soviet maintenance crews kept the Il-2 fleet operational, testament to both the aircraft's robust design and the dedication of the ground crews. The Il-2 Sturmovik represents a unique approach to military aviation, prioritizing survivability and firepower over speed and maneuverability. In the specific context of the Eastern Front, where close air support was critical and where aircraft had to operate over intense ground fire, this design philosophy proved remarkably successful. The armor that shocked German forces, allowing the aircraft to absorb damage that would destroy conventional planes, was the key to this success. Combined with devastating anti-tank and anti-personnel weapons, the armored Sturmovik became one of the most effective ground attack aircraft ever built, and a symbol of Soviet military power. The 36,000 Il-2s produced during the war inflicted enormous losses on German forces and played a significant role in the Soviet Union's victory on the Eastern Front.